in just a minute, but I appreciate everyone having me here this evening. Jimmy came by a few weeks ago, Jimmy Hobgood, and asked me if I would, he first asked me if I'd come do a history of the hotels at Indian Springs, and I said, Jimmy, I don't know anything about the hotels at Indian Springs other than what Frankie has told me over the years, and I said she'll be there, so it would kind of be pointless for me to tell you what Frankie's already been telling you for many years. And then he said, well, what about the courthouse? And I said, that I can do. As I do have a lot of familiarity with the courthouse. I have worked in the courthouse. I have sweated in the courthouse. I have frozen to death in the courthouse. I have watched court cases, and yes, I have climbed up the bell tower and climbed down the bell tower. That's another story I'll get to in a little bit. But my presentation tonight is basically in 5 parts, and some of them are very short and some of them are a little longer. But the first part I wanted to go into is the historical background of the courthouse. Hopefully everybody's familiar with it, has been in it at least once and seen it. If not, I encourage you to drive by the square when you leave and take a good look at it, because sometimes those of us that live here drive by it so much we don't ever really think to just stop and look at it sometimes and just take in what a beautiful building it is and how architecturally unique it is. So some of the history of the courthouse. It was begun in 1897, and they worked on it into 1898 and finished it in October of that year. The reason the courthouse came into being, or the one that we have now, is because, as everybody knows, after the Civil War, Georgia was pretty much in ruins, and then they had Reconstruction, and then it took years for cities and counties to even begin to get back on their feet. So it was a while before they were, felt confident enough to build something as grand as this courthouse. And then the New Georgia movement began, and there was all this industrial building going on, and counties, railroads were coming through, and everybody had this sudden notion that, prosperity was just around the corner. We're all going to be part of this big boom. And it kind of kicked off a nuclear arms race, so to speak, between the different counties. All of a sudden, everybody said, we got to have a better courthouse. And what you'll notice is between a period of about 1880 and 1900 is when the bulk of most of these grand courthouses like these were built in the state. And one county would build one, and then everybody from the neighboring county would sneak over there and take a look at it, and they'd come back and report on it, and they'd say, well, they got this, and now we got to make ours better. And that's kind of what happened. That's how we got our courthouse. That's basically what happened. Just to give you an example, courthouses around in our neighboring communities. Newton Counties was built in 1884 in Covington. Monroe Counties, which is in many ways sort of a sister courthouse to ours, even though the design is different. There's a lot of similarities. It was built in 1896, 2 years before ours. Henry County built theirs in 1897, just a year before ours. And then there were some other ones that were built in the area, kind of in the region. Pike County over in Zebulon built theirs in 1895. Clayton County, which was a lot like Butts County back then, 1898, the same year that we did. So there was all these courthouses going up everywhere, and everybody was trying to outdo each other. Now, not every county around us was part of that. Just give you an example. Spalding County did not actually build their courthouse, and it's not even the one that's there now, until 1911. They still have a much older, they're actually lucky because they have a much older courthouse than any of us do that's still there, and it was the old Spalding County Jail, as it turned out, for years, and it's still there. But they built another one in 1911, and as a lot of you probably remember, it burned down about 1981, one of the biggest fires they ever had in Griffin. And there was a little bit of suspicion about that because somehow, miraculously, all the records just happened to be out of the building when it burned down. So that was a little bit suspicious. Everybody over there was thinking they needed a new courthouse, and suddenly a big fire happened, and nobody was in it. It was in the middle of the night, and all the records were out of it. So you can draw your own conclusions. But anyway, they built the one that they've got over there now, the big one. And Lamar County didn't even exist. They didn't come along as a county until, about 20 years after our courthouse was built was when Lamar County even became a county, and it was carved out of parts of some of the surrounding counties. They built their courthouse in 1931, and it's the same one that they're using, so they're actually still on their original courthouse. Ours is the third permanent courthouse. Now, we've had court in other buildings along the way. There were some gap times there where we didn't actually have one, but as far as permanent courthouses, this is the third permanent courthouse to be used here in Butts County. The county itself, of course, was founded in 1825, and in 1827 they began the first courthouse, and it was finished in 1828, and it promptly burned down. Courthouses and fires just seem to go together, but before they'd even moved into it, it burned down. So they basically just had to start over, and they rebuilt the same courthouse. And they came back, they rebuilt it, and it cost $10,540 in 1828. And if you compute that into the value of today's dollars using the value of skilled laborers, they spent $6,710,000 on that courthouse, because that's how much that money was worth in skilled labor value that long ago. So that building was the first permanent courthouse. The first one, the one that burned, we won't really count since they didn't get to use it. And they used this all the way up until one day when this group of out-of-towners came through Jackson and decided to burn everything on their way through. And we know that was the Civil War. November 17th, 1864, the courthouse was burned. Fortunately, again, like Spalding, all the records happened to be taken out of it, but on that particular day, the clerk of court and what they called the ordinary, which is today called the probate judge, knew the army was coming, Sherman's army, or the division of his army that came through here, whichever it was, and so they loaded all the records of the county up on a wagon and they drove it out of here. And they hid all the records somewhere in a swamp until the army had gone completely through. And as it turned out, all the records were saved. They're all still here. All but one deed book was lost. And we don't know where that deed book is to this day, but all the records from that building were saved when it burned down. So after the Civil War, again, we had this long period of nobody had any money. You consider that Butts County, I think, had around 6,000 people living in it, and they sent 10 or 15% of most of their healthiest, most able-bodied people off to fight in the wars, and several of them didn't come back, and they just didn't have the resources at the time to rebuild a lot of what had been destroyed. And it took a while. They held court in barns and different places around here, and did that until eventually they were able to build the second permanent courthouse, and this was completed in 1873. They didn't spend as much money value-wise as they did on the first one. This was a simpler building, but it was a courthouse, and it was built up there on the square. And they used it for the next 24 years until they got the fever that I was talking about earlier that everybody else was going through. And there was nothing wrong with the building, really, from the records and things that we have found, but you'd be surprised how quickly you can find all kinds of deficiencies when you want a new building. And they did. All of a sudden, the grand jury just said, this is a horrible building. It's just in terrible shape, and we really need to get a new courthouse. So they appointed a building committee. Back then, you didn't really have the board of commissioners like you have today. They had some semblance of that, but they appointed a building committee that would be responsible for putting this together. And the committee was chaired by Judge J.F. Carmichael. And we know the Carmichaels, their descendants are still living here in Butts County. So Judge Carmichael and his committee, and I don't remember all their names, I just know one of them's name was Obadiah. And that's the name that we told our child he should be glad we didn't name him. And I showed him that name in the courthouse before. But the committee, they went around and they looked at the other courthouses that had been built in the area, and they got ideas, and they came back and they decided, we can outdo them. We can have this and we can do that. So they started interviewing architectural firms. Now in Georgia, during this time, there were you had architects all over the place, but there were really two firms that specialized in building courthouses that had already made a major name for themselves and a high reputation. And of course that, once you've got that reputation, those are the people that everybody wants. So they made sure that they interviewed them. I'm going to get off track just a second. The first one was J.W. Goluck, I think is the way his name is pronounced. His courthouses, there were more of his built in Georgia than anywhere else. He didn't build ours, but he built many of our neighboring area courthouses. And the reason I wanted to mention him is because he was in competition with the other firm, and he built, I'll give you examples, he built the Henry County Courthouse in McDonough. He also built the City Hall in Locust Grove, which was actually a college when it was started, the Locust Grove Institute. And he also built the courthouse in Pike County. Now his buildings, while they look somewhat similar to the ones like ours that our architects did, his buildings were very well known for having, he loved tall central towers. And most of his buildings, when they were new, featured really tall central towers that towered up way above the rest of the building, way more taller than our tower on our courthouse. The problem with Goluck is that he was not a professionally trained architect. He was self-taught. He was good at design, but he had very little knowledge of structural engineering. And part of the problem with a lot of his courthouses is that the towers tended to be heavier than the buildings could sustain over time. And as these courthouses began to age and get older, they all began to manifest these structural defects. Not all of them, but many of them did. And so the results were, in a lot of cases, they either had to go back in there when they renovated and put in proper structural support to support the weight of these massive towers, or in some cases they just tore the towers down and put something else up there. Henry County still has theirs, but they did structural reinforcements years ago when they renovated their courthouse to sustain the weight of their tower. He also built a courthouse in Blairsville, Georgia, in Union County. They decided it was cheaper to just take the entire tower off and rebuild it out of high-strength, low-weight materials. And they did. I mean, they completely rebuilt that tower. It looked just like the original one, but it was stronger and lighter than the original one. If you go to Pike County in Zebulon sometime and you look at their courthouse and something just doesn't look quite right about it, because it looks like it has this massive pedestal and then there's this little bitty cupola on the top of it. Well, their tower fell off in a windstorm. I mean, it was a storm, but it wasn't really a tornado. It was just they had a bad storm and the tower just blew over because it was not strong enough to withstand the wind pressure. And they just went back and built something on top of it in its place. And so that's why their courthouse looks kind of ungainly. And you'll notice when you see some of Goluck's courthouses around the state, and you can go on Google and look him up, and there'll be a list on there of all the different courthouses that he built. I think he built 28, and 17 or 18 of them are still here. So he did pretty good on the lower floors. He just had a big problem with the towers. Now there were the other firm, which y'all have all heard about, I'm sure. The ones that the county ultimately selected was Bruce and Morgan Architects. They were out of Atlanta. They were kind of trendsetters and groundbreaking because they promoted themselves as we are professionally trained architects, and that's all they employed. I mean, their architects were professionally trained, and the buildings that they built were substantially better quality because of that. To give you an example, when we did some structural tests on the courthouse a few years ago, and they got lasers out and measured things and everything, and they said, well, it looks like your courthouse tower has deviated a centimeter. That's how straight it is still to this day. And that's just because of the fact that Bruce and Morgan were superior architects. Just to give you an example, they didn't build as many courthouses as Goluck did, but they specialized not only in courthouses but in school buildings, university buildings. Everybody knows Tech Tower. Some of us don't like it very much, but we know it because it's the North Avenue Trade Schools building, Georgia Tech. He designed that. I can't help but throw in a little humor with Georgia Tech. Agnes Scott Hall was also designed by him, and lots of libraries and things. It was actually Parkins and Bruce, and then Parkins retired and he took on Morgan, so there was, the firm kind of mutated over the years, but we got them when it was Bruce and Morgan. They were kind of the dynamic duo of architecture in public buildings in Georgia at that time. So we were very lucky to get them, and they also, as I may have said, did the courthouse down in Monroe County, and that's why we kind of say it's a sister courthouse, because if you go down there and look at it, you'll see a lot of the same architectural features on it. And some of these people, after churning out design after design, you're going to see some overlap before it's over with, because it's just almost impossible to design so many buildings and make every one of them completely unique from the other. So you'll see some similarities. But one thing they tried to do is make the towers unique on each one of them. Ours is completely different looking than the tower on the Monroe County Courthouse. I have here, I just brought some, and I'll just pat Jim if you'll start it around the room. This is the original architectural rendering that was presented to Judge Carmichael and his committee by Bruce and Morgan. They also misspelled county. They were good architects but bad spellers. But this is the original this is a copy of the original architectural rendering, and you'll just pass that around, Jim. You'll see a couple of features on the original rendering that made it to the original courthouse, or to the courthouse when it was built. Two things, the weather vane and the flagpole. Neither one of them are on the building anymore. But otherwise, the building pretty much looks exactly the same as it does in that rendering. We don't know what happened to the weather vane or the flagpole, but they're both gone. You can see where the weather vane used to sit on top of the steeple of the courthouse. You can see the mount where the flagpole was on this side, I'm sorry, I'm directionally challenged sometimes too. This is the south side of the courthouse. So the south entrance is actually considered the front door, the one on this side, and you'll see the flagpole mount up above there. So, as I said, they not only designed buildings all over the place, but Butts County was very unique because we had actually 4 buildings in this county that were designed by Bruce and Morgan. They had experience here. And the one thing that I do know about one of the hotels at Indian Springs is that they designed the Wigwam, the biggest one at Indian Springs. And that was built in 1890, according to the information I have. I think it burned in 1921. But they also designed the Jackson Presbyterian Church and the Carmichael House and the courthouse. And that's kind of a unique story because you've got to consider the time all 3 of these buildings that are still here today, all of them are, within a couple of blocks of each other, were all built around the same time. The Presbyterian Church was built in 1897, the Carmichael House and the courthouse in 1898. Judge Carmichael was chairman of the courthouse committee. His brother John Carmichael built the Carmichael House, and both of them were on the building committee of the Presbyterian Church, so you tell me. They apparently liked his work so much they wouldn't let him go. They just had him continue to design buildings that today, I think any of us would agree, those 3 buildings are among the most unique in town, and certainly among the most beautiful buildings in town. So anyway, the current courthouse, this is an interesting note. The grand jury told the committee, don't spend more than $20,000 on the courthouse. They did go over budget a little bit. Courthouse went to $25,080. And I did a conversion of that money into today's dollars, and that came out to about $5,990,000. We could certainly not replace that building for that amount today. I can't imagine what it would cost to replicate that building today. And of course, it's been in continuous use as a courthouse for 118 years. I think the only time that court has not been held in the courthouse was earlier this year in the winter when the boiler finally went out on it. The warranty on the boiler went out in 1903, and it has continued going ever since then. So it had a 3-year warranty on it, or a 5-year warranty, and after that it continued on until this year, and it's been repaired many times. It started out as a coal furnace or coal boiler, and then it was converted over to fuel oil, and then eventually to natural gas. But it's been the same boiler that has been there all along, but we finally had to get a new boiler. And the reason why was when they finally went down to the basement to see what was wrong with it, it was shooting flames out the back, about 15 feet out the back of it. Fortunately, it was in a brick room, but still, at that point we knew we could no longer find parts on eBay anymore or anywhere else that they had scrounged parts for this boiler over the years. So that is kind of a history of how we got the courthouse and when it was built and everything. The second part I want to talk just a little bit about. I don't want to get too heavy into architecture, but I want to talk about its architectural significance. Who can tell me what the architectural style of our courthouse is?
Gothic.
No, it's Stucco, isn't it?
Hmm?
Stucco?
It's a little bit of everything. And that was one thing Bruce and Morgan liked to do, is they like anything they saw on some particular genre of architecture, they tried to figure out a way, well, how can we match this with this? And this is a completely different. They found ways to do it. Primarily, though, the architectural type of it is Romanesque Revival, High Victorian Eclectic, and Colonial Revival are the main three architectural styles used in that building. And I won't get into what defines the differences and everything other than say Romanesque, the big arched windows and those kind of things are of that kind. Colonial Revival, it has pediments over the sides, the north side and the south side. That's primarily of that kind, Colonial Revival. A little bit of Greek Revival. And of course, Victorian is all the fancy stuff that's on there. Whereas the Carmichael house is more primarily a Queen Anne, and it sticks to Queen Anne with a little bit of Victorian. Everybody calls it a Victorian, and it's not. It's a Queen Anne, but it's got a little bit of Victorian in it. So it's kind of a mixed breed of architectural styles. Courthouse is built on a cross plan, which means it has 4 doors, one on each end, like many of them of the time did. And that if you look at it from the air, take the tower off of it, it kind of looks like a cross from the air. You have the wings that jut out to the side. And of course, it has the bell tower on the south corner, and it rises in 4 stages, and that basically means it has 4 different levels on it. I can tell you, though, that if you think it's a 4-story tower, it's not. It's a lot taller, because I climbed it one day. In 1998, Gene Pope and I had this wild idea while they had the scaffolding all the way up to the top of the tower that we were going to climb the ladder up there and see what the view looked like from the very top of the tower. I mean, you can get into the bell tower, you can get into the clock room, but you can't get up to the top of the pyramid on the top. And we did that day. And that was 15 years ago. I was a lot younger and in better shape, and it nearly killed both of us. Because it's a lot harder to climb a ladder when it's completely straight than when it's leaning. And this one was completely straight. The tower is probably more closely, in terms of like this being a story, it's probably more like 7 to 8 stories tall in this kind of, if you look at what a story is today. Stories back then were a lot taller. The rooms in the courthouse are a lot taller, and that's because they didn't have air conditioning. And they still don't, mostly. So, I'm going to lose my place here. Courthouse is crafted primarily of brick. Most of it's brick. There is, and you can't really see them for the shrubbery, but it's got beautiful stone foundation all the way around in places. But you can see it matching pointing, and that's the little crisscross white bricks that go up the side corners, and what's on the bottom looks exactly like that. And let's see. Yeah, it's about time to send another picture around. Has everybody got a chance to look at the architectural rendering? And y'all can keep that if you want to. Put it with all your, I know y'all keep a lot of stuff. I unveiled this picture on Facebook in the last few days, because anytime I find a new picture of an old picture of the courthouse, I try to say it. This is the courthouse when it was brand new and they colorized it. I also have one where I took the color out of it because I can't stand that. If it's not supposed to be colorized, then I want to see how it really looked. But I brought the colorized version. The courthouse is brand new. The reason we know that is because there's no statue in front of it, which came in 1911. There's no electrical lines, which I have a picture. Jackson Square was ugly when they put all those. I mean, they put poles and lines everywhere up there, and they didn't have any of that there. There's no cars, but there's a horse and a couple of buggies parked on the square. And when you look at it, I wish I brought the black and white version, because if you look at the black and white version, it really looks like an old picture, and they tried to colorize it. But on that one, you can see there's no shrubbery around it, and you can see the foundation. Also, somewhere along the way, I guess they decided courthouses need to be on a hill. And we didn't have one, so they made one. They just brought in tons and tons of dirt and made a hill around the courthouse. It was almost flat to the street at one time. And so they covered up a lot of that foundation with dirt to make a hill, just so it would have a hill to sit on. I cannot speak for the predecessors of the commissioners in office today, but I mean, apparently the people made some interesting decisions back then too.
Michael, any knowledge of what happened to the wrought iron fence around it?
Yes, they sold it for scrap, And I think it had something to do around 1911 when they put the statue in. There was a fight going on with the city because people were starting to drive cars, and the horse owners were having a fit about it, and the city was going to get rid of all the hitching posts because they really didn't want people bringing their horses and parking them on the square and leaving horse excrement around the square and everything. So they figured if they took all the hitching posts out, that only the automobile owners would come. But apparently at the time, the farmers and people still had considerable clout back then, and they won that battle, and so the hitching posts got a stay of execution for a few more years. But at some point along the way, they took that, the fence was sold for scrap iron. And don't know what the reason for that was either. It may be because of when they decided to build the hill, the fence wasn't going to work with that anymore. I don't know. So to the courtroom, has everybody ever been in the courtroom? Has anybody not been in the courtroom? Oh, come on. The paper's never been in the courtroom.
I have not set foot in the courthouse yet.
Okay, well, go over and take a look at it.
I'll be going
The
tomorrow.
courtroom was almost identical to Monroe County's. That was one thing that the two almost shared. Monroe's is a little bit more elaborate. Their ceiling is a little bit more elaborate. But the courtrooms are basically the same. Paul mentioned the balcony that's in the courthouse. Well, there's also balconies on the outside that nobody ever thinks of being there. And if you drive on the city pharmacy side or you drive on the Big D drug side, and that's how we in Jackson define everything on the squares, by which drugstore's on the corner. So if you drive down either one of those sides and you see those big long porches they have on the side, and on top there's railings and everything, those are actually balconies. There's a picture on the web on our historical page of the courthouse when on the centennial in 1925. That was the centennial of the founding of the county. Y'all don't forget, we've got another one coming up here in the next several years we've got to start thinking about. Those balconies were full of people. The center windows in the courtroom, those big arched windows, you just raised the window up and you walked out on it. I mean, they would raise up as tall as a door. They don't do that anymore because the windows have been sealed up, because old windows tend to let a lot of cold air in during the winter and they rattle and everything, and the judges got tired of it, so the windows have been sealed up as far as that to keep temperature and climate in there from getting out of the room. But that was how you used to get out on the balconies. And of course, before air conditioning, they had to raise all the windows anyway just to keep the courtroom bearable. The balcony itself was actually just opened up again in the last few years. It had been closed for a long time because the courtroom's the only room in the courthouse that has a true central heating and air conditioning, or central air conditioning system. And the only place to put it that they could figure out when they did it was to put it in the balcony and then enclose the whole balcony so that you didn't hear all the air conditioning stuff running. They opened that back up a few years ago, so it's closed to the public because the staircase is not much, that gets up there is not much wider than this podium. People were a lot smaller back when that courthouse was built. If you don't believe that, look at the main staircases when you go in there and try to hold the rail as you go up the stairs. You're going to be walking up the stairs like this because the rail was built for people who most of the time were about 5 feet tall. That's about as tall as most people got back then. And today they're inadequate. I'll get into that in just a minute too, about some of the issues with the building. The building's built mainly, though, as I said, of brick. Interior, we have marble floors in the main foyer or the main level. All the marble was quarried in Georgia. And it's in geometric patterns. There's pink marble, white marble, gray marble, and really dark marble baseboards. The baseboards are actually about this tall. And we just had the floors refinished a few years ago, and when they finished them, they really shine like mirrors. I mean, marble is just it's a beautiful material when it's cleaned properly and cared for, and our floor is still completely intact. So that's one thing that's very positive about that. There are 3 main levels in the courthouse. There's a basement that used to only be accessible from the outside, and that was mainly for storage. And back, I think, in the 70s or 80s, they did some renovations, and they put in an elevator, such as it is, and a staircase inside so you could actually go into the basement. They had more offices down there, restrooms down there. The main level, of course, held almost all of the offices of the county at one time, because county governments at one time only handled a few essential services. and you could house them all under one roof. Not just having the court in there, but you had the commissioner's office, whatever it's called, the commissioners of roads and revenues, after it finally came along, and that they were in there, and all the other county offices, each one had their own little section. And as counties grew and more services got added on to counties, and they had things such as recreation parks and fire departments and things like that, they outgrew courthouses and they spread out. Of course, the second floor level is mostly the courtroom. It's the largest room in the building. It's supported with wrought iron columns, and you can see one of them downstairs that was not hidden in a wall. Most of the columns that support the courtroom are hidden within walls, but in one of the big areas downstairs, that used to be the tax commissioner's office years ago, there is actually an exposed column, so they put a decorative one in there. It's all wrought iron, and it's painted in historical Victorian colors. Whether appropriate or not, I don't know, but it's an interesting column. And then up in the courtroom itself, the balcony is also supported by smaller versions of this. The courtroom itself is probably the most original room still in the courthouse that still looks, for the most part, like it did when the building was built. But most of the other rooms in the building have been radically altered over the years. Of course, I can get into that again in just a minute. One quick story about the courthouse tower. You have your residents who are there Monday through Friday in the courthouse, then you have your residents who live there all the time. And in this case, biggest enemy of courthouses are pigeons. And pigeons love tall places, and that's why they habitate on the courthouse clock tower up there. And years ago, somebody came up with an ingenious solution of how to get rid of the pigeons. They went over to Beckham's, which was the old dime store across the street, and I do remember this because I was a kid then. The original solution had been they'd actually had shooting matches trying to shoot the pigeons, and all they did was just blow holes in the side of everything up there that had to be repaired in the restoration of '98. But they went over to Beckham's and they bought a bunch of big rubber snakes because pigeons are mortally afraid of snakes. And then they went up there and they staple gunned them to the pediment that goes all the way around. So we couldn't see them from the ground. None of us down on the ground would have known they were up there. But they went up there and they just, stapled these snakes around the pediment. And then as time went on, rubber and the sun did not work very well together. The snakes began to degrade. And then one day we had a windy day and the snakes started turning loose and landing on the lawn of the courthouse. And we had a few people that were nearly literally scared to death almost. And anyway, they said, go up there and get those things, whatever's left up there, get them off of there. But so that was one story about the courthouse clock tower and how we, not we, because I did not have anything to do with that decision. Like I said, I was small. But that was one solution to getting rid of pigeons. And they're still up there. And of course, they're part of the reason why we have to repaint about every 10 to 12 years. You have to with an old building anyway. Fortunately, with the courthouse, very little of the outside requires painting, with most of it being brick. The window frames are all wood, and it's all original. None of them have been replaced. The courthouse steeple, when you get above the brick arches where the bell is in the arch area, in case the one you see when you go by and you see that big open arch, the bell's actually in there. The clockworks is up in a room inside that white thing on top of the building, the one with the pyramid top on it. And to get to it, you basically have to climb up a series of ladders through the tower and everything, and then go through a hole about this wide, and to get up into the clockworks. But that whole part is actually made out of wood, and it's sheathed in tin. So everything you see from that arch up that is white, except for the dials of the clock, which are glass, believe it or not, they're white glass. The rest of it is all tin that's attached to wood, and because it's tin, the wood is intact and it hasn't rotted and been exposed to the weather. But that part has to be painted every so many years. In one of the earlier restorations in the 70s, and that was not considered a good restoration because of a lot of what they did inside, but the good thing that they did do is they took the old black dials that were on the clock off, because the only way they could light them was they had these poles that stuck out on all four sides and shone basically household floodlights onto the clock face. They replaced them with white glass dials that were custom made for that, and they were able to backlight it from inside the tower room. If you go to YouTube and just Google or put in YouTube Butts County Clock Tower, you can see a video of what the clockworks look like, because the guy who services all of these clocks, he goes around to the different courthouses and actually services the clocks. And he takes video of it when he does that. So it's a good place if you want to see what the inside of the clock room. It's a whole lot easier to do that than climbing up there, believe me. And it's not as hot either. But it's an interesting thing to see. The clock is original. It's an 1898 Seth Thomas clock. Originally, it was powered like these big grandfather clocks you have, where they had chains and pulleys and things like that and weights. And to power the clock, you'd pull this long chain that used to be in the courthouse, and that would pull the weights, and over the week, the weights would go down, and that would power the clock. That system eventually failed, and it could not really be repaired. And when they did the restoration, the first one they did in the 70s, and they put the new dials on there, they were able to put an electric motor that powers all the gears. It's the same clock, but it just basically, it's like taking a wind-up watch and turning it into a battery-powered watch is what they did. But all the works are still there, and they still work. And it still keeps pretty good time most of the time. When it stops, then we know we have to call the service guy. And he doesn't hardly charge anything, because he just loves working on those things. I mean, to him, it's a thrill just to be able to go in these places that 99% of the people in these counties have never seen. Because, I mean, most of us have never, I've been lucky to have seen it. I don't really care to go back up there again. I mean, it's kind of scary up there if you want to know the truth. But it's a unique to see some of these places in the courthouse that most people have never seen, like the attic over the courtroom. I didn't even know we had an attic until several years ago. But the back side on the what we call the Deraney side, or the Jackson Drug side, actually has 3 floors. And there's a small suite of offices above the 2nd floor on the back side that was originally part of the attic, and then they said this is a nice space we could make into offices, because it has a staircase that goes right up to it. And that part is actually 3 floors back there. And I've lost my train of thought of where I was going with that now. But
Attic over the courthouse.
oh yes, well if you go up into that office suite and you go into this storage room and you open this door, there is this enormous attic, and it's full of law books from the 1890s, because they didn't throw any of them away. They just threw them in the attic, and they're all still in there. So again, I only stuck my head in the door and looked a little bit. I didn't want to go in the attic, but it's enormous. We had to close the 3rd floor though, because there's only one way to get up there, and because of the requirements of the Fire Marshal and the Americans with Disability Act, and the staircase going up there also being about as wide as this podium, we couldn't really let the public go up there anymore. So that part is actually closed, but we hope to someday have that back open again. So what happened to the building over the years? This is the 3rd part, where we talk about a little bit of how the building has fared over its 118 years. And like most buildings, they go through different periods. When they're built, they're the new building, and everybody loves it. And then when it gets about 60 years old, it's that old building. Then when it's 100 years old, it's like, wow, that old building. A beautiful historic building, but by then it's had a lot of problems. During the phase of time when these buildings are just that old building, people have these bright ideas. Let's try to make it into a new building. And this is in the 60s and the 70s, nobody cared anything about historic preservation very much. They just said, let's take this old building and let's try to modernize it to the standards of the 1970s. Not the best decade you want to kind of use as a period that you want to try to modernize your building to. So let's cover up all of the beautiful hardwood floors, which actually look almost identical to this one, with carpet, so that we can make the offices more efficient and less noisy. And let's cover up these plaster walls with wood paneling, like you would use to finish a basement. That's what I think of when I see that paneling. It looks like a basement room that you turned into a game room. So a lot of the beautiful stuff in there was covered up. And then to make the rooms more energy efficient and to keep some of the heat in there, let's drop these 18 or 20 foot ceilings down to about this height and put this kind of ceiling in. And if you go on the main floor of the courthouse and you look up, that's what you see, is you see this kind of ceiling in there. Nobody knows that underneath all of these tiles is all this beautiful woodwork that is completely covered up by this kind of stuff. And ugly, ugly fluorescent lights and things like that. And that was modernization in the 1970s. And Since then, not a whole lot has been done but patch and Band-Aid, except for one thing. Back in around 96, the commissioners who were in office then said we got to do something about the building. So let's try to restore the building. So they passed a SPLOST, and in that SPLOST they had the local option sales tax. They had money set aside. How am I doing on time, Jim? Am I okay? Okay. They set aside money to do a restoration of the courthouse without really taking into account how much that was going to cost. First thing they did was they did the exterior, stabilized the exterior. That meant they repointed all the bricks, which I understand repointing is basically where you go and you get all the mortar and you put new mortar in there and then you clean everything. They cleaned all the brick, cleaned all the pollution off of it, repointed all the bricks. Then they refurbished all of the tin components that make up the steeple. Got that. Some of them were damaged. There's little urns on each of the four corners. You may have noticed, and over time, their tin is not really sturdy, and the wind up there is a lot worse than it is down on the ground at times. The tins get bent, and so some of those had to be refurbished. But excuse me. Basically, when they got done, the exterior was completely where it needed to be. Oh, and they put a new slate roof on it because somebody took the old slate roof off of it for some reason. The Carmichael house still has its slate roof on it. It's the original one when the house was built. I don't know if the courthouse got a leak in it one day and they said, well, we probably just need a new roof, and they ripped the slate off and went and put a shingle roof up there. But anyway, during that restoration, they put a slate roof back on there. Properly maintained, that slate roof should be around when the building's gone because, I mean, it's just the slate never deteriorates as long as it's properly maintained. And so exterior-wise, the courthouse was as good as it could possibly be gotten in 1998 for its 100th birthday. But all they had left was about $80,000, and that's not enough to do what needs to be done on the interior, not even close to what needs. The interior is much more detailed of what needs to be done. Frankie, you've restored buildings. You know the interiors, all the details and things, and how, if you want to preserve that, it's going to take a lot to do it. Old buildings have asbestos in it, and the courthouse certainly has its share of it, and that has to be taken into consideration. You have to think about the age of the building itself and what it was designed for and what it's being used for, how it's being used today. So you think about when the day they turned the key over to Judge Carmichael, the streets in Jackson were dirt. There were no cars anywhere in downtown Jackson. Electricity was several years away. Running water was several years away. There were no bathrooms in the courthouse. I don't know where they went to the bathroom. I don't know if they had outhouses then or what, but there were no bathrooms in the courthouse. It was built for its period, and then progress hit, and they had to put electricity in. So they said, we got to wire this big building now. So, and that wiring is still in there. It's been rewired twice since then, don't worry. It's not as bad as it sounds. But they didn't pull the old wiring out. They just went in, every time they rewired, they just ran more wiring. So you can find the ages of the wiring jobs by looking at the materials that was being used at the time. The original wiring is cloth wrapped. And then the newer wire's better stuff. But it's all old. Even the most recent wiring job is probably at least 40 years old. And when it was put in, there were no copy machines. There were no computers. Really weren't even electric typewriters. I mean, the only thing that was electric in the building was the lights and, maybe some electric fans that they had to use during the summertime. Then they put air conditioning units in, and these were window air conditioners. Because that's really, and if you go to any of these old Georgia courthouses, you're going to see window air conditioning units sticking out of different offices because that's the way they did it. All of these pull a tremendous load. So occasionally the building has brownouts where the lights will suddenly just like, ooh, what's going on here? And you'll hear the air conditioner start to get slow, and then it picks back up, or the breaker flips, and Judge Biles knows where the breaker is, and she goes down and flips the breaker back on and comes back up, and everything resumes. I'm saying this in somewhat of a humorous way, but it's not really funny. It's concerning to all of us, and that's why there's been a lot of discussion lately about what to do about the courthouse. I have some ideas, but So anyway, bad restoration jobs minus the 1998 period. That one was a good job. That one needed to be done. The exterior was stabilized the way it needed to be, but it just wasn't complete. The interior was not done. And we knew afterwards, and I was working for the county by this time, but not really involved with that project, but we knew that the only way to do it is you got to get everybody in there out. You just basically had to move them out, shut the place down, get the asbestos out, take all this out and all that junk that they put in there out, strip it down to its original look, and then restore it the way it needs to be done. Now that's a very simplistic explanation of really how complicated it would probably be to do that, but it can be done. If you don't believe me, Monroe County did it a few years ago, and they did a spectacular job with their courthouse. It is, in fact, I'm going to look at it next week. This is going to be like a repeat of 1897, where we're going to go down there and look at their courthouse so we can come back and figure out how to do something with ours. Anyway, one more. I have another picture I wanted to pass around. Actually, I'll pass both of these around because I know we're running out of time. This is after 1911. This color, another colorized one. But you see the statues on there, but you can see the black dials that the courthouse clock tower had then. This one was taken, I guess they wanted to take one right after the new statue was put up there in 1911. They had shrubbery by this time. Just like the shrubbery today, some of it looks out of control. And but it looks, I mean, doesn't it just look beautiful how it looks there? This one's not quite as pretty, but I just wanted to show you, this is what downtown looked like. This is the only picture we have ever found of the courthouse from the back end, the north side. Look at all those ugly power poles. But also neat that I'd never seen were one of those big magnolia trees. There was actually a walkway that went up the corner side from Jackson Drugs right on up to the building there. And you can see that right above the word house in Jackson. So I'll pass this one around too. I'm sorry it's a little bit grainy. I tried to make those as big as I could, but you lose some of the detail when you're blowing the pictures up like that. So as I mentioned, those were the kind of the phases that courthouses go through. The only phase we don't ever want to see our courthouse go to is the phase of non-existence. And as I mentioned before, Spalding County's courthouse burned in the 80s. We've lost a few already. Some of you may have heard about Hancock County in Sparta 2 years ago this month. Their courthouse burned, and they lost everything they had in it, including all their historical records. The only thing that was left was the outer walls. And they just decided we're going to build it back just exactly the way it was, and that's what they did. Fortunately, that one was one of the ones that there was an identical courthouse in another county, and they had plans for it, and they let them borrow it. And they have, if you drove over to Sparta, Georgia today, I know the county commission chairwoman over there because she spearheaded this. I mean, the loss of that courthouse, I talked to her about this, the loss of that courthouse deeply affected the residents of Hancock County. They'd seen it for years. It was in that old building stage in their minds, and it just, nobody cared anything about it until it was sitting there smoldering in ashes, and it deeply affected all of the people in that county. They missed it. Their centerpiece was gone. All that was left were the outside walls. So they decided after they had structural engineers come, and they said, well, you know what, this thing was built right because these walls are in, there's nothing wrong with them. They're just scorched, but they're perfectly fine. They rebuilt it exactly. Outside it looks exactly like it did before. You would never know that building had ever burned. And I'm telling you, when I'm saying this is not like, where it partially burned and they fixed the stuff that did. This was about 90% of the building was just gone. And they put it back, and you'd never know that it was, that it had ever done that. Till you walked inside, and everything inside it is modern. Because, they really couldn't put the inside back like it was. They actually turned a 2-story courtroom into a 3-story building because the courtroom was so tall. They said, we don't need these anymore this size. They're not practical. So they actually made another floor in there, and they increased their office space. But they've got their courthouse back. But not everybody has been as lucky as that, and that's just not something. I think people in Jackson and in Butts County would be devastated if something like that happened to our courthouse, because it is, at the time it was built, it was probably the greatest source of civic pride in this old community. People used to get in their wagons and spend the whole day riding in from Worthville and Talaga and the outer reaches of the county, because it took most of the day to get to town just to come to court. It was the only entertainment they had. And they would just come and fill up the courtroom to just see the spectacle of court trials and get to spend a day. And for something, and for people who were, a lot of people were living in houses that probably cost $1,500 to build, this was a palace. And this was their civic pride. And in spite of all the new stuff we've built, and I love our administration building, I think it looks great and everything, but it's not that courthouse. It is not those materials. It does not have that history in its halls. It does not have some of our ancestors' names in books and things up there in that building, and you cannot replace that building. Hancock County did what they could, and they're very grateful that they were able to, but they still don't have the history inside those walls like they had before, and all those records and things like that. So real quickly, because I know I'm running. Am I okay? How are we doing on time? Okay. I'm going to skip on ahead a little bit and just go over some of the major things that today are concerning us about that building. Physical access. Of course, as I said, the way it was built, you have 4 entrances, but because of the security concerns and things that have happened, and I'll just say, the Brian Nichols incident that happened in Atlanta, that's what changed security here in our building. So only one side of it is accessible now to the public, and that's the one on City Pharmacy, and that's because you have to go through metal detectors and everything. But so, and the reason they put it on that side was because there was a handicap ramp built on that side at some point along the way. It's not very attractive, but it's functional, and you can get in the building. But physical access to the building is one of the problems. The location of the building being located in the center of the square, for people who have difficulty walking or can't walk, it's a hike to get to the building in the first place because it's not convenient. And if we ever do expand the building, we would probably do it in the back and expand the entrances right up to 2nd Street, which would make it more accessible to people. That's a story for another day, though. As I said, the exterior is in really good shape. The only thing that you really have to do with the exterior is you have to repaint it about every 10 to 12 years, and it's getting harder to find people who will do that. Those aren't easy buildings to paint. You can't just go get Joe the painter to come paint your courthouse with a tower up there like that. But there are people who do it, and it costs a good bit when you do. That's why we try to use really good materials when we paint it and hope that they will hold up. But we're still trying to figure out how to get rid of the pigeons. That's our biggest thing with paint. The electrical system, as I've told you what the conditions of the electrical system is, and the demands that modern technology and equipment make on that building. So if we were to do a complete restoration of that building, we would want to take all of the old wire out. We want to put state-of-the-art wire in there and communication cable for computers and all that kind of stuff. We want to make sure that modern offices could work in that building. We don't want it to look like a modern office building, though. If we ever do get to restore it, and I hope that we will, we would want to put it back as close as we could to the way it looked. Because now, with the way things are in technology and everything, you can do a lot of the stuff that you couldn't do even 20 years ago. You can put modern heating and air conditioning in that building, and you can hide the ductwork, and you can put it in places you couldn't do 20 years ago. They told us for a long time you could not air condition fresh air barbecue. It just wasn't possible. In 1984, we did it. Right after I said I'll never work in this place again. And then they put air conditioning because believe me, it was 115 degrees in August before air conditioning was put in there with that pit. But you can do all this kind of stuff. They make lighting that looks like the original lighting. In fact, Judge Wilson put some new lights in the courtroom that are beautiful and actually go with the courtroom and look better than the ones they put in there in the 1940s. And so you can do that. So climate control systems, you need that in the whole building because right now you've got pockets of hot and cold. The main corridor has no air conditioning at all. So everybody shuts themselves in the office to keep their air in there because if you open the doors to the hallway, then all your air is going out in the hall and right on out into 3rd Street. So you have these different pockets of hot and cold. Boiler heat is fine. Boiler heat works really good when the boiler works, and we have a brand new boiler. But it's on or off. I mean, it's like, it's like my wife says I drive. It's either stop or wide open. And that's just, I mean, that's the way it is with boiler heat. You can't fine tune it like you can heat and bump it up a degree or two. It's on or off. That's the way that system works. Believe it or not, we're still using the original pipes and radiators. When we hooked the new boiler up and pressure tested it, and everybody was sitting there crossing their fingers and saying, God, we hope this thing don't blow, because, you know, the new boilers and the pressure that they put out, I mean, you know, they're wide open boilers now. The old boiler was just kind of crawling along as best it could. Not a single pipe leaked. Not a single one. Worked perfectly. And that's just, again, a testimony to the people who built it and who put all that stuff in there. Plumbing is another issue. There's not enough bathrooms. There's one ladies' bathroom on the main level and one employee bathroom. That's never enough with court. And then the men have to go down into the back side of the basement, which is currently closed right now because the basement has issues too. It needs to be cleaned out. It needs to be sealed so moisture can't get in there. And part of it has to do, I know you've probably heard Mayor Pippin talk about the condition of some of the pipes in downtown Jackson that have got to be replaced because the original water system is still providing water in Jackson. It's got to be replaced, but that has caused us some problems in the courthouse. So a restoration, we would need to put in modern plumbing and things like that. And then, of course, floor-to-floor access. Has anybody ever taken the elevator in the courthouse? Did anybody even know we had an elevator? Jim knows. Yeah, Jim's more like me. He worked for the county for years. There's basically a door that just looks like a closet, and if you open it up and you pull this metal grate aside, there is an elevator that 2 people can get in standing or 1 person in a wheelchair. So you basically, if they're in a wheelchair, you have to back them into the elevator, hit the button, and get out, and then send them up and have somebody on the upstairs waiting to get them when they come up. It's basically a residential elevator. That's all they could fit in the building without, and it is a historical building, and they didn't want to tear everything up trying to put a modern elevator in there. So that's floor-to-floor access is another big issue. As I said, structurally, the building is structurally in good shape, but it does have asbestos that would have to be taken out. All of the hardwood floors are covered up with carpet except for 2. Judge Wilson, when he was up there, and he was actually in the office, it used to be my old office, that was the former clerk's office and about 40 people before them. He restored that office himself. Got the carpets out, except there's one piece of carpet left in there, and that is under the original safe that they brought in through the windows when the building was being constructed because there was no other way to get it in there. They want it out now. They said, we need to get rid of this thing. It's taking up room. And I said, good luck. You figure a way to get it out, we'll get it out of here. But it's not going anywhere because, I mean, basically the only way they got it in there was they got a lot of men on ropes and pulleys, and they pulled that thing through a big open spot before they put the window framing and everything in. It weighs about 1,500 pounds. I told them another reason you don't want to move it is because if you go down in the basement, there's a big structural floor brace under there holding the floor up that's holding the safe up because of the weight. I said, the minute you roll it off that floor brace, it's going in the basement, and you're never getting it out of here then. So, needless to say, the safe is staying. And I'm glad it is because it's original and it's a beautiful safe and it still works. Because they just built things like that back then to work and to last forever. I've already covered how the ceilings and everything and all that would need to be taken out. Just some conclusions I'd like to make. And you know, our courthouse, it's a unique architectural building. It is, in my opinion, irreplaceable. It has things in it. It has history in it. It's not something that we ever really want to see go away. We would like to see it. I mean, you think about these 4 guys that sat around a table trying to figure out how to get something with $20,000, which granted was a lot of money back then, and they still went over budget. But I'm sure they felt like there was a good reason. They probably had to add something to it to make it like they wanted it. But they're sitting here in 1897 looking at plans for this thing, and they probably never dreamed in their wildest dreams that the building that they would be responsible for in the 19th century would still be in use in the 21st century and still being used as a courthouse every week. You ask some of the attorneys who practice in there after they get through with the litany of things that are wrong with it, but don't you touch it. That's, you know, fix it, but don't you ever think, and if anybody ever tells you, I hear the commissioner's office is going to tear that thing down and build a new courthouse, that is not going to happen. They're not going to tear that building down. I promise you that. So, because if they try to, I'm going to be up there with everybody else. But it's not going to happen. And it's true that, like I said, they don't build buildings like that anymore. They really don't. If you go in there sometime, just look. Don't just go in there to get a gun permit or see Betsy about something. Go in there and look at what is not covered up by ceiling and stuff like this. Look at the materials that are in use in there. Look at the floor and how perfect it is after it's been walked on for 118 years, and it's still perfect. It has no dips in it. It has no sagging places in it. You roll a ball along that thing, it's going to go from one end to the other. I mean, it has a few little tiles that maybe be a little bit misaligned from time, but I mean, the floor is still in great condition. I mean, the materials and everything in there, you just can't replace all that kind of stuff. And finally, whatever the decision will be about building new courthouses or adding on to it and everything, the most important thing we've got to do, and we need to do it in the next few years, sooner rather than later, is we've got to go on and really put together a plan for a complete restoration of that building and put it back like it was, but make it better. Make it work in the 21st century, but make it a tribute to the 19th century, because we don't have too many 19th century buildings left in Butts County. So, and that's about it. And I did bring, I know y'all think, golly, Michael did this 18-page report just for this. Just coincidence. I put this together for the commissioners, and I said, this is perfect because I can use this for this meeting too. I had no idea how many y'all would have. I only brought 10 of them, but I will be glad to email it to Jim, and Jim can get it out to everybody. So I'll let y'all fight over it. I would like to give one of these for the Historical Society, keeping their records of stuff they keep, because I know they keep records about all this kind of stuff, and there's the other ones. And like I said, I'll be glad to email Jim a copy of it, and he'll send it to any of y'all that want a copy, and the one y'all get will actually have the color pictures. The one on the front is the one I took of it. That's how it looks today, and because I wanted to make my own picture contribution to it as well. But do I have any questions? Yes?
Do you have a vague idea what your impression of a complete restoration would cost?
$2 million at minimum. Then that's just a restoration. If we, let's just take, I know you read about the ideas in the paper and the different places. Let's just take all those off the table for a minute. If we added on to the building, based on the amount of space that we think we could get out of the land that's up there, and it would only be on the back side, and you'd have to match it to look just exactly like the building, like they did in Jasper County and like they did in Henry County. They built annex or new wings that look exactly like the old building. Then you're talking maybe $5 to $6 million, but that beats 12 to 13 million to build a brand new one, and that's what you'd probably be looking at if you build a brand new courthouse, based on about $250 a square foot for the. It's what they estimated the space would cost.
You know how long that would take?
To do a complete restoration.
Like what you just
Not really, because I am not an expert in that, and until we can really get inside there and take out some of that stuff and see what we're really dealing with. Fortunately, termites don't like cord, I guess. That's the only thing is, with one exception, there is an enormous beam, and there's a basement in there, but I mean, there's like you have the basement you can actually go in, and then you have like a crawl space that goes all the way into the building, and there's this massive beam that runs from one end of the building to the other. And if something happened to that beam, the whole building might come down. So, we keep a close check on that beam and make sure termites are nowhere near that thing. But there's areas in there that once you take walls out and you really get into the walls and look at things and get the plaster back exposed and stuff again, we might find other things, and that could cause delays. But every indication that we have is that overall the building is structurally in good shape, structure-wise, because it was just so well built to begin. They overbuilt that building.